Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our beautiful, indigenous, biblical, and indivisible capital, Jerusalem, since King David's time. Today, I'm not just sitting down with someone who personally has a hand in the history of the Jewish people. I'm also blessed to call this man a friend. Ari Harrow, welcome.
It's great to see you, Avi.
It's a pleasure. Always. It's a pleasure being able to see you again, schmooze with you, and have this very important talk. But Ari and I go way back to working together as advisors in a camp back in our teenage years. Right. And today we're going to be speaking about his book, My Brother's Keeper, Netanyahu, Obama, and the Year of Terror and Conflict That Changed the Middle East Forever. And those of you who are not familiar, who is Ari Harrow to be writing such a book? Ari Harrow was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's former chief of staff and one of his closest advisors for years. How many years?
I was with him for probably a dozen years in different capacities. The last few as his chief of staff.
In the Prime Minister's office during the Obama years as well. And I remember you, when you just began working with him, I think it must have been the year 2000 or 2001, yeah. And we had a meeting in your office in New York when Benjamin Netanyahu was the head of the opposition party, the Likud party at the time, and you were helping him build up the party again, working in New York, and then you continued working with him for years.
Yeah.
So I guess let's start with this, even before going into the book. How was it to be working with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu all these years? Opposition, right. Prime Minister, running the country behind the scenes. What 2 cents can you give us as if we were a fly on the wall?
Well, I guess I'll divide the answer into 2 parts. There's the individual, and then there's the position and the work. The individual, on a personal level, I personally believe, gets a bad rap. He was a pleasant person to work with, not somebody who got angry and yelled and screamed, but really somebody who was very focused and very driven to accomplish what it is he sets out to accomplish. And as long as you were ready to put in the hours and to put in the time, then he was somebody that was a pleasure to work with. I very much enjoyed my time working with him. Had tremendous respect, obviously, for someone of that stature. And it ties into, I guess, the second part of that answer, which is working with him is not just working for an individual, it's working for a greater cause. And
if I might say it, you're literally working for the defense of the whole Jewish people, not just to run the Jewish state of Israel.
Completely. And I can tell you that the first time that I saw Benjamin Netanyahu, I was actually working for a pro-Israel organization at the time, Honest Reporting, and I was sent to the annual AIPAC conference in Washington. This is, as you said, in the early 2000s, and it was the first time I had read his books, the first time that I had seen him appear live, and he gave a speech to the large plenum, and I was blown away. I was blown away at the conviction, at the ideology, at the clarity of message. And it was at that moment that I said, this is the person that I want to, attach my my future to. And it didn't take that long. Within a year or two, I was working with him in initially on his campaign to take over the chairmanship of the Likud. And over the next decade and a half, I served in various positions with him and around him that allowed me to play a small role in his
much bigger role,
his leadership and the future and the present of the country and the state of Israel.
And just to give a little introduction to my viewership, and again we're going to get to the book, but I just want to go on a little tangent for a second. Those who watch me know I've been talking about the issues we have here in Israel with our judicial system, with an elite within Israeli society that try to run the country, and their enemy number one, their biggest enemy all these years has been Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which I explained to my viewers. They've been after him with legal cases, legal warfare, since he was first elected back in 1996. And for those of you unfamiliar with the news cycle here in Israel, Ari Haro has received a lot of headlines because in their legal warfare to go after Netanyahu, they've gone after almost every single right-hand man, consultant, advisor, who have been close in the inner circle of Netanyahu. So they've gone after Ari Haro as well. A total witch hunt, which I do not wish that on anyone in terms of the impact on your personal life. So on the one hand, there is the working on the successes, on the diplomacy.
Right.
Are you able just to give 2 cents of how it has been to work with the most vilified leader of Israel, where there's an internal battle? It's not just the external challenges diplomatically to stand up for Israel, but at the same time juggling in the air to fight off the internal witch hunt against him, which doesn't give him a second to breathe and lead as if he was able to lead properly without that internal witch hunt against him.
There has to be a very clearly defined goal for any individual that wants to find his way into the leadership of the country or those surrounding the leaders of the country. I moved to Israel as a child with my family. We moved to the Shomron, to Neve Eliza, Karnei Shomron. I grew up during the period of the First Intifada, demonstrations in Tel Aviv for heightening our security. I saw the influx of Russian Jewry and the return of refuseniks like Natan Sharansky and Aide Nudel, the Second Lebanon War, and so on and so forth. And you recognize as a Jew living in Israel, as an Israeli, that we are living in historic times. And in historic times, there are naturally historic challenges. And when you have that in mind, some bumps and bruises along the way should not deter you from what you're looking to accomplish. And I can just tell you that I took a little bit of a hiatus from my role in government for a few years between the period that I was bureau chief to the Prime Minister and then when I became chief of staff to the Prime Minister. And when the Prime Minister called me up and asked me to come back as his chief of staff, many people advised me not to do it. They said, nothing good comes of it. They're looking to, he's a vilified individual. They're looking to create scandals around him. You don't want to find yourself in that position. And ultimately, when I looked myself in the mirror and was able to define that my goal here and our goal here is to do what is best for the Jewish people, for the land of Israel, for the state of Israel, then everything else became secondary. And I can tell you today, even after having gone through what I've gone through, I would not have changed anything. I would do it again, and I would do what is needed to protect the future of the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland.
Wow. And everybody, that is a hero of Israel, right? And again, I have all the respect in the world for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and everything he's doing, but it's thanks to people like Ari Haro behind the scenes, whether you know of them, you don't know of them, you know their names, you don't know their names. This is the generation of King David-like Jews we have today, building up the future of the Jewish people here in our ancestral homeland. So, first of all, unbelievable answer, and thank you for all of what you've done and what you're still going to continue to do for us. So now let's go into the book. Wow, you were a fly. You were literally a fly on the wall, or not even. You were a person in the rooms dealing with 8 years of the most hostile United States presidency against Israel, which we can get into today's situation afterwards, but let's focus on the Obama years. What was important for you to give across in writing this book?
There were two main historical perspectives that I wanted to bring to the table when writing this book. Number one touches on exactly what you just mentioned. There was an internal debate here in Israel and definitely in the United States as to the true nature of the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama, who was at fault, what the real issues were. And I felt that from a historical perspective, it was very important to get out the truth, at least as I saw it from within the Prime Minister's office. And in essence, sort of cutting to the chase with that, Netanyahu never perceived President Obama or any other individual as a personal enemy. It was always about what is good for the state of Israel, what is good for the Jewish people. And secondly, as we progress beyond the Obama days and the ever-changing reality in the region that we live in the Middle East, I felt it was very important. We look to the peaceful developments that have taken place, the Abraham Accords. Suddenly there are Muslim countries that have reached substantive peace agreements with Israel. It was important for me to highlight the fact that the kernel or the seed that developed into this beautiful new development really was planted back in those days because of Netanyahu's extremely vigilant and tough stance in representing our true interests. When he did that, it brought about peace in the region. And for all the naysayers out there, those that go against those principles, when we project weakness, when we project a future in this country where Israel does not look out for its own security interests, we're actually harming the existing peace, and we're preventing any future expansion of the Abraham Accords.
100%, and that perspective is so important because we see it again today, where you have the voices in Israel, like, just give in to the pressure from the Biden administration, just give in, and again, I call it the Obama, Biden, Harris, Blinken administration, but just give in. And no, what you're saying is exactly that. Because Netanyahu did not give in to Obama and stood up for our rights and the justice of our cause, that is, and you explained it better than anyone can because you witnessed it, that is what opened up the door, because the Muslim countries saw, oh my God, Israel's not giving in to Obama. They're a strong country, we want to hook up with Israel. So the way I explain, one of the ways I explain Netanyahu over to my viewership is, it's only because of Netanyahu that we don't have a Palestinian state, a dangerous, what I call an Islamo-Nazi Palestinian state in our borders today. Because any other realistic option for a prime minister during those 8 years of an Obama presidency would have fallen under the pressure, and we'd be living in a much worse situation than we are. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I definitely think that those that competed against Netanyahu for the crown of leadership would have taken the country in a very, very different direction. Netanyahu was always very strategic in his dealings with the United States. He never lost track of what his ultimate goals were. I can say from a security perspective, he had to focus not only in his dealings with the United States, but the international community on Iran and the threat that it poses against Israel and the opportunity that it brings to the region, as we just stated. Right. So the idea of creating a Palestinian state, and he was the one really who fathered the notion of peace outward moving in rather than in moving out. It's not a Palestinian state that's going to bring the Arab world to peace with Israel. It's going to be the Arab world that brings a Palestinian entity into peace with the Jewish state.
Okay, so now I want to touch upon two cases where really highlight Netanyahu standing up to President Obama like no one else ever did or could, or any world leader. And to hear your insight on the, I guess, the decision making, or on the guts it took to actually do that. Number one is in the Oval Office, right? There's that meeting where basically Obama was giving over his pressure about whatever it was, Palestinian state craziness, and Netanyahu basically gave him a speech about the history of the Jewish people and the land of Israel, and Obama was shell-shocked. Like, Netanyahu totally had him, like, the White House was livid. So I'd love to hear your feedback about that. And then the other one is also the opportunity that was given to Netanyahu to speak in front of both houses of Congress,
Right.
which again was against the wishes of Obama. That was about the Iran deal to try to knock away at the support within America for
Right.
moving forward with a very dangerous Iran deal. So I'd love to hear whatever insight you're able to tell us about those two cases.
I'm going to separate the two of them, although there is some overlap between the two. Netanyahu's vision or his foreign policy belief vis-a-vis the United States was always more extensive than a direct relationship between prime minister and president. While that is important, it is critical that the two heads of state try to work together, and it's helpful when they get along and when they're friends. There are many, many examples, not only in Israel's history, but in every country's history, where you can have leaders that don't necessarily love each other, but the countries are able to get along and prosper. Netanyahu's vision of the United States always included a number of other levers. First of all, there's Congress, okay? The United States, as opposed to, autocracies across the world, has a system whereby there are, balances of power, and Congress holds a tremendous amount of input and influence over foreign policy decisions. And that is an arena that he spent a lot of time on and made sure that the messaging that he had was not just for the White House, but that he spoke to Congress. When he came into the Prime Minister's office, he implemented a rule that I believe is true till today and was different from any other Prime Minister in Israel. And that was, any member of Congress that comes to Israel, doesn't matter what party, he would meet with them. He would meet with them because he felt that developing that personal relationship and conveying the right messaging and conveying our interests and our concerns to them would ultimately allow him to benefit in any talks with the administration.
And I can give from my side, I work with congressmen and bring them to Israel and bring them to meetings, congressmen and senators, Jim Jordan, Mike Johnson,
right.
Two of the big names today, and many, many others. So yeah, and his right. door is always open to meet with them.
So that is a policy decision that he made as soon as he entered the Prime Minister's office. Secondly is the media in the United States. While the media environment in the United States has definitely changed over the last 2 decades, he is a big believer in the ability to influence policymakers in Washington by speaking directly to the American people. America is a country that has a very structured system that allows the voters to actually play a role and influence their elected leaders. And that is another arena that the Prime Minister never gave up on. It's something that he implemented and integrated into his foreign dealings with the United States on an ongoing basis. You'll see him on Sunday programs, you'll see him on cable channels, and right. so on and so forth.
Right.
And the last piece of that is, let's call it, directly to the American people, which in most cases would be the Jewish community, the evangelical Christian community, and other pro-Israel communities around the United States. And I would say not only the pro-Israel communities. I mean, there were many times where he would do outreach himself to minority groups to make sure that they were hearing our side of the argument as well. So when you put that all together, his view on how to deal with the United States was not just about what am I saying to the president in a Four Eyes meeting in the Oval Office, but there's a much broader platform here. So when you talk about that first incident in the Oval Office and the press conference, all of that is going through his mind. It's not just about, I think it was, I think somebody described it as the undressing of President Obama in the Oval Office, but it was the opportunity to speak to a much broader audience about Israel's stance on these issues and the red lines that he as Prime Minister was not willing to pass. So that is something that obviously that incident became a well-noted one. But it was very much in line with the way the Prime Minister dealt with the United States in general.
But I do want to emphasize, he did that knowing the anger and the wrath it would develop within Obama and his administration, and didn't decide not to. No, I have to do it.
I have to do it. And that sort of leads me, or transitions into the second incident, which was the speech to Congress, which till today is a very highly debated issue. Was that good for Israel, or did we harm ourselves with the Democratic Party? What was the bottom line with it? And I think it's very important to put that into historical context, and I write extensively about it in the book. Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed Congress in the beginning of 2015. Okay, President Obama was elected at the end of 2008. He enters office in January 2009. Prime Minister Netanyahu returns to the Prime Minister's office in late March of 2009. So when you get to the beginning of 2015, they're working together already for almost 6 years. Okay, that's a long time. There's a well-documented relationship. They have their opinions of each other. They've gone through ups and downs, etc. And that year, that year prior to the speech in Congress, found Israel and found the Prime Minister in a position where he felt that he did not have a choice. Now, what do I mean? Again, we don't have to get into the whole history of it now if you don't want to. But
no, go as deep as you want.
Okay, so early on in Netanyahu's term, it was in, I believe it was, in 2009, he gave his famous Bar Ilan speech where he recognized the need to create a Palestinian state.
Right. Which created a lot of anger from his base, like myself and other right-wingers and Likud voters, because we voted for him because we thought he would stand like a wall of China against that.
Correct. Now, it wasn't something that, this wasn't an example like we've seen with some other leaders in Israel where they get into office and then they shift their ideological beliefs. It was much more of a tactical decision, looking at the broader picture, which in his mind, and I guess history will decide whether it was correct or not, was we need to deal with Iran. Iran is an existential threat, and if we have to make certain concessions on the Palestinian front that will allow us to get the Americans on board with Iran, then so be it. And that was sort of the dance that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu were in for the first 5 years of their, let's call it, partnership.
Right. And just to clarify, for those who do not remember the details, anyone who goes back and looks at what Netanyahu actually said in that Bar Ilan speech, while he threw some breadcrumbs to Obama, ultimately, you look at the conditions he put for his agreement for the establishment of a state called Palestine, they're all unrealistic. So it's still Netanyahu basically saying, okay, I'll play the game with you, but still on my terms. So
yes, I mean, that's one example. There are other things he did where people in your neighborhoods, and myself included, we're not very happy. For example, he implemented a building freeze on all new building in Judea and Samaria. There were other steps that were taken.
Handing over Hebron, parts of most of Hebron.
That was earlier.
Right.
Yeah. But this was, in his mind, part of a very complex diplomatic game, which was, from Israel's perspective, being played in order to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And what happens in 2014, and what leads to that speech in Congress in 2015, are two very, very important milestones. Number one, 5 years of attempts, I would say even negotiations, between the Americans, Israelis, and the Palestinian Authority to try and enter some type of concrete negotiations, come to a complete failure and stop. It's early in 2014, or maybe it's around May 2014, where those negotiations, it was actually Secretary of State Kerry who was trying to establish a framework for negotiations. So there were certain concessions that he wanted both sides to make prior to entering the room. Israel, as usual, agreed, and the Palestinians, as usual, did not, and that brought an end to the negotiations. But that was a huge milestone, not because the Palestinians said no. We've seen that a million times over. But it was an opportunity for the Americans to call out the Palestinians. The Israelis said yes, and you said no. You are at fault for the peace process not moving forward. And that's not what happened. What happened was, as we've seen many times over and over again throughout our history, the blame fell on both shoulders, which in essence falls on Israel's shoulders. Right. And in parallel to that, the Americans were holding secret negotiations with the Iranians on some type of agreement that would lift the sanctions against them. And in 2014, they move ahead on what's called the JCPOA. And ultimately, Netanyahu looks at the reality that he's facing. And he says, I've danced this dance for 5 years. Mm-hmm. The Palestinians bring this to a failure, and yet you're putting the blame on us. And at the same time, you're not moving towards tackling the Iranian problem. You're actually fueling the Iranian problem. If this is if this is the reality that we as a country are living in, if this is the reality that we, or me as the leader of Israel, is living in, then we need to change the ground rules. And that is at the point that he comes to a decision that he's going to accept the invitation from Congress, because the reality between the two countries has changed. And ultimately, it was sort of his, I guess call it, his Menachem Begin moment. He didn't know whether or not he was going to be reelected. His speech in Congress was given not long before the elections of 2015. Right. And he wanted to know that if he loses the election, he did everything in his power to move world opinion and U.S. opinion towards dealing with Iran and not capitulating to Iran.
It's unbelievable to hear like the behind the scenes, and those are really two historic moments for the Jewish people and the Jewish state of Israel, and especially must be taught, if it's not yet taught, in schools of diplomacy and international politics. But I just have to make a little caveat, because I'm going to get comments of like being angry at me. Yes, everybody, I tell everyone there is no such thing as a people called Palestinians. They're Arab Muslims who happen to live in our midst, Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. Sometimes in conversations, it's used. But I'm just, because people are going to be Avi, you say not to use it, and then in your own talks, people are using it. So there we go. I'm putting it out there. So, any other like interesting stories you want to share with us from that you get in the book to also pique people's interest to purchase it?
Yeah. No, I mean, I weave into the source of the story that I write about as a backdrop for the Netanyahu-Obama relationship really starts with the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli high school boys who ultimately were murdered. I was chief of staff at the time, and dealing with that incident, which then led to the last war in Gaza. They were intertwined and connected. Israel, in search of the 3 high school boys, rounded up hundreds, if not thousands, of Hamas terrorists in Judea and Samaria. And in response to that, Hamas Gaza began by firing rockets into Israel, and slowly but surely that escalated to the point where Israel goes to war. And it is shocking to me today. Well, I can tell you it wasn't on October 7th of this year, because October 7th I was shell-shocked together with everyone else in this country. It probably took me a week, at least, maybe longer, to just wake up one day and say, wait a minute, my book talks about this. What we saw and what we dealt with in 2014, be it Hamas, be it Gaza, be it the potential infiltration across Israel's border and the taking of hostages, be it the pressure from the American administration and the lack of clarity as to needing to defeat this evil. it all played out in 2014. And reading it with what we know today is extremely, extremely shocking. And with that as a backdrop, obviously, I tell the story of Netanyahu and Obama, and I tell the story of a chief of staff who sees and hears and feels that. One story that I'll just touch on, which is actually just a little bit more of a personal story, which answers your previous question about Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it was the day that they found the bodies of the three high school boys that were murdered. It took about a month until they were found. And we were working out of the Prime Minister's office in military headquarters in Tel Aviv. And the head of the Shin Bet, Yoram Cohen at the time, middle of the day, unannounced, shows up and says, "I need to see the Prime Minister." He goes in. 5 minutes later, he comes out and leaves. The Prime Minister calls in his inner staff. So there's maybe 5 or 6 of us who enter the room. I mean, Yossi Cohen, who later becomes the head of the Mossad, at the time he's the National Security Advisor. Mandelblit, who becomes Attorney General, was the Cabinet Secretary, myself, and so on and so forth. And the Prime Minister tells us that they found the bodies. And we spend maybe, a minute around the table, and the Prime Minister turns to the group and says, "I need a couple minutes. Can you guys wait outside?" And everybody gets up and everybody makes their way out of the room. And as I'm about to exit the room, the Prime Minister yells out to me, says, "Ari, come back." So I'm the only one to walk back to his desk. The door closes. I sit down and I get emotional even telling this story. And tears start to run down his face. And the meaning, the depth of that moment for me was so massive. The fact that a Prime Minister of Israel can be so connected to every Jewish life, the fact that this wasn't just another terror attack, was not only moving for me, it reinforced my belief that we are on the right side of history, that he is the right man for this job at that moment. And it was just a very, very unique and special moment. So that's one of the stories that I touch on in the book.
Wow. And since you went there, if you don't mind me asking, at the time, as you explained and brought us all back to that moment in time, 2014, we, in a sense, we didn't officially go out to war against Hamas in Gaza, but we had an operation against Hamas in Gaza. Can you take us back and explain why we didn't go out to war against Hamas in Gaza, which I imagine can also help people understand the predicament we're in today, the similarities, even though differences?
Yeah.
And to preface, because a lot of people today, I mean, it's insane. You have the political left and the media today blaming Netanyahu for why he was in power all these years and didn't destroy Hamas and didn't go to war against Hamas and has been giving money to Hamas, and it's his fault Hamas is so strong, where they were the ones against all of that for all these years. So again, just giving that as some background to understand.
So first, let's define the difference between an operation and war. The truth of the matter is that, at least in the limited territory that we operated on in 2014, there wasn't much of a difference between then and now. Right. In other words, the difference is really more a technical difference. When you declare war, there's certain powers that the government has, there's certain economic decisions that need to be made vis-a-vis the military, vis-a-vis residents, and so on and so forth. So as far as the operation, from a technical perspective, that's one of the differences. As far as why did we not finish off Hamas in 2014, I can tell you that, and you hear about it a lot now, the conceptia, right? The concept that, and speaking now post-October 7th, there is more than a kernel of truth in that, unfortunately. There was a belief that if we go into Gaza, and I'll tell you another story actually that I don't touch on really in the book. When Netanyahu was re-elected prime minister in 2009, maybe a month before the election, a month or so before the election, he was head of the opposition, and he and I went down south on a campaign trip.
Oh my God, I remember this. Yes.
And I mean, there were Israel was actually in its first war post disengagement at that point, or first operation post disengagement, and there were rockets falling in Ashdod and Ashkelon and Sderot and and Ofakim and all the cities down south, and we made our way around to the different areas campaigning and running for cover and bomb shelters and the whole bit. And in our car ride back to Jerusalem at the end of the day, I asked the prime minister, I said, what would you do different?
But, and correct me if I'm wrong,
yeah.
He was saying, if I become elected prime minister, I'm going to destroy Hamas.
He did say on tape,
right,
on that trip, actually.
Right, that's what I remember.
Yeah. That if I am elected prime minister, we will wipe out the Hamas.
Right.
But then I asked him in the privacy of his car, okay, you're prime minister, what are you going to do different? What does that mean? And in essence, what he said to me is that if you're looking just for deterrence, because at the time, if you recall, this was under Prime Minister Olmert, ground troops were sent in up to a certain point, and they did do, there were battles in some of the northern sections of Gaza. So Netanyahu said, if you're looking for deterrence alone, don't send in ground troops. Use the Air Force, bomb them, from here to tomorrow. But ultimately, stick to it from a distance. If you send in ground troops, then you better be ready to conquer Gaza. Now, what does conquering Gaza mean? Okay, conquering Gaza, and now I'm sort of skipping to 2014, because, by the way, I actually reminded him of this conversation in 2014. Conquering Gaza meant, according to the estimates that the military was sharing at the time, thousands of soldiers dying in battle, and finding ourselves in a position where, number one, we're isolated internationally, and number two, what do you do the day after? So some of the dilemmas and some of the debates that are taking place today were the, in essence, the deterrence against taking action back then. And the idea that we don't have a great solution for this in the minds of the military leadership, the security leadership, and I have to say the political leadership, which included Netanyahu, that is ultimately what prevented Israel from going in and completely wiping out Hamas. You may recall that in 2014, the stated strategic goal was to try and deal with the tunnels that had crossed into Israel. Yeah. They couldn't allow a reality whereby they have tunnels that cross the border because there was a fear that they would come across and that they would take hostages and that they would take over communities. So that was the stated strategic goal for that war, but the rationale behind not doing a complete job and not properly dealing with Hamas was unfortunately the mistaken concept that we don't really have a good alternative solution.
I mean, again, I'm just going to go into the commentator position for a second before following up, because everything you're saying, let's put it like this: we see the longer we push off solving the problems we have, the harder it is to solve them, because they get stronger, and international pressure is growing against us, and the way the international community and America direction politically everything's going. So I mean, like, oh my God, if we could have only taken care of it in 2014, it would have been much easier than it is today. However, one thing I do explain to people is the major difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, the major difference between 2014 and today, we would not have had the public of the Netanyahu and his government would not have had the public of the Israeli people to go to war in 2014 like we're going to war today. And it's sad, but it's only because we were massacred that there is a unity of the Jewish people today to do what we're doing today. And even with our situation today, you have the political left and the media and the elite trying to stop us from winning and doing what is necessary to ensure that we're truly safe. So I guess my follow-up position is, with that 2014 perspective, how do you think we're doing today, which again, we're dealing with the external diplomatic pressure of a Biden administration, who, like, I don't know, I will say it, they once again, it's very clear, they're working together with Iran and Qatar and Egypt and Hamas and throwing us under the bus, even though we're their ally. At the same time, we have the internal forces of our own politicians in the war cabinet, as Benny Gantz and Eisenkot, who are also working together with the Biden-Obama administration to stop the war and potentially topple the government, and the whole media and elite working together with that. How is Netanyahu doing today with the war efforts, knowing this is our complex reality?
Right. It obviously is an extremely complex reality. And let me just touch on one point before I answer your question, and that is, at some point, we lost our way as a country. And I don't blame it on this or that side of the political map, because I think it's everybody. One of the central pillars of Israel's military doctrine from our inception and for many decades was that battles and wars have to be fought outside of our borders, because we're too small a country. We cannot survive when the battles are taking place in the state of Israel. And we accustomed ourselves, we adopted a reality where rockets are fired into Israel, meaning the war is being fought on our side of the border. And because we had these miraculous defensive capabilities, we allowed
Iron Dome, for instance.
Iron Dome, for instance, we allowed for that central pillar to be displaced.
Before you continue, I want to let people understand even deeper, and I talk about this once in a while, and I'm going to go back to the Second Lebanon War. All right, I was called up to the Second Lebanon War. That's the summer of 2006, and it was a disaster, and I was in it, and I saw how much it was a disaster, and I was talking to my higher-ups how much it was a disaster, and I have a personal story, which I'm not going to get to right now. But part of the disaster of the Second Lebanon War is because the military at the time had already made operational decisions based on that premise, that they outsourced logistics, meaning we had soldiers in Lebanon, we couldn't get food to them. Our soldiers, my units were in Lebanon, we were not getting food. We had to eat food in the Arab homes because the caterers that the army outsourced the food to would not drive into Lebanon. And the debate and the thinking was, we will never have any wars again outside the boundaries of Israel. They let go of units, tank units, the equipment. We were in a total disaster status to be able to fight that war. And that's 2006.
Yeah.
So furthering the doctrine you're referring to.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there was a policy shift, whether it was declared or not. And it moved us away from really a central component of our military doctrine. So, looking at today's war, I don't want to give any one individual a grade, but I do think that it's important for us to understand and for our listeners to understand. You know, it's funny because this actually appeared in this past week's Parsha, the Chukotai. Rabbi Sachs talks about it in his Dvar Torah. I won't tell you his whole Dvar Torah, but he starts off with an example that I've used many times in many different situations around the world.
You're referring to the rejection of the rejection?
No,
it's everyone?
It's about the direction a people an individual or a nation take. And he talks about ways. You know, Israel is world famous for our technological prowess and our unique inventions. And Waze is probably the most famous
WAZE, the driving app.
Right.
There we go.
Right. Everywhere in the world, people use Waze. And Waze is fascinating, right? It's unbelievable. But it has one huge flaw.
Okay.
And that is, if you don't tell it where you want to go, it can't tell you how to get there. If you tell it where you want to go, it will offer you 10 different options. You can go this way, you can do this, you can do anything. You want to go a little, you want to take your time, you want to get there faster. That's already up to you. But where you're going to, that needs to be calculated. That needs to be accounted for first and foremost. And when you look at the situation we're in right now, and this goes back to those same trepidations that we just spoke about in 2014. What was the leadership? What was the security leadership, the military leadership, the political leadership in 2014 worried about? They were worried about what happens after. And you look at today's situation, and you say complete victory, which I completely agree with. And you know what? I think 95% of Israelis agree with. Number one, I believe that hasn't been clarified to us.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? What exactly does that mean? People are willing to pay the price in, you know, blood, sweat, and tears. It's been a horrific 8 months for us living in Israel, for Jews all over the world, for supporters of Israel all over the world.
And you're talking to someone, I have 2 sons right now in Gaza.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Families like yours, people that we're both friends with, have lost family members, have lost children. It's a heart-wrenching period for us as Jewish people. But we all can get behind action knowing that we're going to reach a very clear goal that's going to put us in a better position. Number one, that goal hasn't been clearly defined. It hasn't been clearly defined. You talk about the internal squabbling of the cabinet, or the security cabinet. They have not defined to themselves, let alone to us, what exactly that means. You know, they use very broad terms. So that's number one. And number two is the day after. Again, I'm not one of these people. We don't have to broadcast everything to Hamas and tell them that this is what we're doing. But if there's not a clear plan in place, what ends up happening is you end up dragging your feet. Do we need to destroy Hamas's infrastructure in Rafah? 100% we do. Do we have to destroy Hamas's infrastructure in the refugee camps in central Gaza? 100%. But we also need to understand, how are we going to reach a reality where Hamas is not going to threaten us in 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And I feel that today's leadership has yet to define that in a very clear way, even to themselves. And that is what brings about some of the dissension that we're seeing in the country today. And
what bothers me is, like, forget about ideology. And I can go into ideology in a second. I will go into ideology in a second. Not even ideology, our purpose that doesn't get talked about. We are disconnected. Our leadership and our military leadership, I mean, obviously political leadership, but they're not getting that information from military leadership either. We're disconnected from the basic ABCs of warfare. I mean, it gets Warfare 101. An enemy attacks you, you go destroy them, and you take that land. You don't allow them to remain there to attack you again. And that's the price they pay. I mean, again, without being any military strategist, and again, without getting into the geopolitics of it, because obviously they're geopolitics, but just that basic thing, it's like we're going, our leaders are making somersaults in the air to explain why we're not even doing what the most basic general who is educated to protect the civilian by winning should know to do. I'm going in, let's say we're starting northern Gaza. And again, I'm not going to push you on this why we're not doing this. And that's not why I'm saying this. I'm saying this more for the listeners. But we're going to northern Gaza. Every day we push, we're taking that land. You're not getting it back ever again. You want it to end? You want us to stop taking the land? Surrender. Give us our hostages. No, another day we're going further south and further south. You're going to, okay, we'll take it back. if you're not surrendering and you're not giving back our captives.
Right.
But that's not even being used as, whether or not they want to do it or not. It's not even being used as a strategic tactic. Instead, my son was in for a month in the city of Jabalia, and they didn't even leave yet. The army didn't even pull them out, and they saw tons of Hamas terrorists coming back because they had misinformation. They left already. And then, and this makes my blood boil, they asked for permission to shoot at these terrorists. And the high command said, no. Your mission right now is not to kill the terrorists. And we just want you to come out of there safely because they were supposed to come out there the next day. So they did not get permission to shoot at the tons of terrorists that were coming back into the streets of Jabalia.
Yeah.
And his own officer was livid. He goes, what do you mean I'm not allowed to shoot at the terrorists? That's what this war is all supposed to be about. But the high command said no. And then they're out, and then their officer sent them a video. It's totally filled with that area of Jabalia destroyed. We succeeded in destroying it. But it's filled back with the terrorists.
Yeah.
You can't win a war like that.
Right.
It's impossible.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think that, take World War II as an example. The leadership of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, they made it very clear early on that nothing short of unilateral and complete surrender is going to bring to an end of the war.
Right.
That is a very clear stated goal. Using that as an example, if that was Israel's stated goal, that we are not going to stop until Sinwar comes out of his hole waving a white flag, we're going to keep going. That's a stated goal. Then you know what you're fighting for. If we go into Jabalia and we clean it out, but then we leave and we allow people to come back, then what did we accomplish? Is there a strategy here? What is our end game here? What is our goal? And I think that the soldiers are starting to question it. The people, both from the right and from the left, are starting to question it. And I think that is what is lacking amongst the messaging of the leadership, and even in our ability to stand up to international pressure. If we knew exactly where we're going, using the Waze example again, if this is where we're going, then there's different ways to get there. That's okay.
Right.
You can play this game, you can do this, you can do that, you can pause to release hostages. Anything is possible if you know where you're going. And that is what I believe is lacking today in
right.
our...
And on that point, I actually just wrote an article a number of weeks ago, and I speak about it, and I just speak to some Israeli mechinot, like 18, 19-year-old Israelis before they go to the army, and they're about the situation and moving forward in Israeli society and the war, and I tell them, we've been lied to, we here in Israel, for 76 years, because we were all told the importance of the Jewish people having the Jewish state of Israel post-Holocaust was in order that we can have a safe place. Finally, our own country to be safe in, where we can defend ourselves. And my viewers know, I'm talking about how blessed we are to be able to be in our own country to defend ourselves. But that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to be the Jewish people living in our ancestral homeland and making a difference for humanity by being in our ancestral homelands, which again, that can have its own discussion. But it's not about being safe. Like my call to my fellow American Jews is like, you don't want to come because you don't think it's safe? Well, first of all, it's not safe anywhere in the world for a Jew right now. Statistically, it's much safer in Israel, even with the war and the terror, than anywhere else in the world and wherever all Jews live. But you're not supposed to be living here because it's safe. We're supposed to be living here because God said, this is the land for the Jewish people. I chose you to live in this land. Trust me. Follow my ways. This is the place of how you impact the world to make the world a better place by you being a Jew and the Jewish people living in your ancestral homeland. That's the reason. If you use safety as the reason, well, God's giving us a message. No, you're not supposed to live here because it's safe. You're supposed to live here because you're Jews, and this is the place where you're supposed to live and make it the best as possible. Right. And the borders expand. Ready? The borders expand, and they will be expanding, all in the right time. So, Ari, why should people keep purchasing your book?
I think that it's really a small piece of history that's extremely, extremely relevant to today's current affairs and today's realities. And it really gives you a little bit of an insider's view and insight, not only into stories that have taken place, but to the thought process of our leadership, the goals of our leadership, and how the inner workings of the Prime Minister's office really takes place. So it's a unique opportunity to really see things from that perspective, and hopefully people enjoy the read as well.
You guys all got a teaser. There is no reason that anyone watching this is not clicking on the link below to purchase this book. And for everything Ari just said, and hopefully what you heard here, again, it's just a teaser, and there is so much more that is so important to know. Last words, last message, optimism, hope, dealing with today's situation to leave everyone with?
You know what, I think that as a Jew, we always have to be optimistic, and we always have to be hopeful. With all the challenges that we face after 2,000 years dispersed throughout the diaspora, to be able to return to our ancestral homeland, to build a state, to build an army, to build miracles every single day is just a special and unbelievable honor for those of us that live here and partake in it. And really just to thank you, Avi, because there are many concerned Jews out there. There are many supporters of Israel, but there aren't many people that put their entire life and soul and energy into getting our story out there and making sure that people really know what's going on here. So thank you, Avi, for everything that you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Ari Harrow, everybody, you're clicking on the link below. It's an Amazon link. It's a website link. Amazon link. I guess if My Brother's Keeper, Ari Harrow, search for it, click it, buy it, read it, send in your comments. Thank you so much for the talk, Ari. Really appreciate it. Everyone, signing off for another episode of The Pulse of Israel here in our ancestral and eternal homeland, the land of Israel, in our beautiful, biblical, indigenous, and indivisible capital, Jerusalem, since King David's time. You are not yet a subscriber, go to pulseofisrael.com and click to subscribe. You enjoy these videos, you believe that these messages should be seen and heard by more people, just click on the donate button every once in a while. Shalom, everyone, and thanks for watching.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.